And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. We have a very special guest for you tonight for the first couple hours. Roger Stone back with us. I've been waiting for this date for a long time. He's been under a gag order for some time now, 16 months. It's finally been lifted. Roger, of course, is a political consultant, lobbyist, author. A couple of his books include Stone's Rules and Jeb and the Bush Crime Family. And he was, of course, pulled into the Mueller report investigation, convicted on 7 counts, including witness tampering, and they say lying to investigators. He has been sentenced to 40 months in federal prison. That's about to begin, and we're going to be talking with Roger about all this. The gag order has been lifted. Roger, before we get started, how are you and your family? How are you weathering all this?
Well, we're doing extraordinarily well considering. I mean, first of all, how about the concept of a gag order, that a defendant in a criminal case loses their right to defend themselves? That's not only unconstitutional, it's un-American. In my particular case, the judge reasoned that if I were allowed to speak on, say, shows like Coast to Coast, or to post on my social media, I would taint the jury, which makes no sense at all because the Washington Post and CNN were pounding on me every day for 2 years. Were they tainting the jury? Judge offered no evidence or proof of this. It was a theory. Actually, it's kind of weird. If you go to Google Trends, the only time people looking up my name spike is when the judge attacks me from the bench. So if anybody was tainting the jury, I guess it would be her. As you point out, I have been tightly silenced for 16 months. Roger Stone, who can't talk, is like Usain Bolt that can't run. And I'm really grateful to you, George, to have the opportunity to tell my side of the story. Anybody who will look at my case objectively will realize that I've been the target of a political prosecution, and I am the last victim of the Mueller witch hunt. When I was charged, I said I would be exonerated, but I believed I would have a fair trial. And as I outlined, there was nothing about my trial that was fair. There was nothing about my jury that was impartial and indifferent as required by the law. So let's start at the beginning.
And let's tell people, Raj, also just what this was all about in the beginning. You know, the WikiLeaks, the emails.
Exactly.
Yeah, so go ahead.
During the 2016 campaign, both from public sources and from a tip, a guy named Randy Credico, who is a progressive radio host and a comic impressionist, I heard that the WikiLeaks disclosures of material that they had obtained regarding Hillary was explosive, and I heard that it would be released in October. I teased that on my Twitter feed, not to aggrandize myself, not to be important, but to make sure the mainstream media could not sweep it under the rug when it happened. There has never been any evidence whatsoever that I knew the content or the source of the material. I had a tip, and I rode that tip very hard. In about 2018, there began a series of stories that were leaked to CNN, MSNBC, that various associates of mine, friends of mine, former associates of mine were being dragged in front of the grand jury. And, of course, they wanted to know whether I was the link between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks, which I most definitely was not, or if I had some connection to the Russians, which I most definitely did not. In fact, I later learned that Robert Mueller's dirty cops went to a federal judge and a magistrate and told them they had probable cause to investigate me for treason, conspiracy against the United States, violation of the foreign contribution ban, fraud and related activities in connection with computers, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, aiding and abetting a felony, unauthorized access of a protected computer, and accessory after the fact to a felony. After a proctological examination of every square inch of my life, all my emails, all my text messages, all of my phone calls for at least 2 years, Mueller and his dirty cops found no evidence whatsoever of any of those crimes. It was then that I was charged with lying to Congress. Really? Lying to Congress? You mean like General Clapper or John Brennan, Hillary Clinton, James Comey, McCabe? This list goes on and on. There's a difference, though. Those people lied about significant things, important things. Clapper, for example, lied about whether we were tracking American citizens by collecting metadata.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, I argue that when I went to the House Intelligence Committee, first of all, I went voluntarily. I wasn't compelled. I testified for 4 hours, and any misstatement I made was immaterial. In other words, there was no underlying crime for me to lie about. So what actually happened here was that Robert Mueller and his prosecutors, the people who prosecuted me become kind of key to the story, essentially colluded with Adam Schiff and set up a series of gotcha questions, none of which were particularly important. For example, did you get an email from Steve Bannon on August 2nd? I don't remember. Aha, you did. Yes, but it's a discussion of a story in that morning's Washington Post. No secret.
And Headsay would say you lied.
You lied. Now, so to violate the False Statement Act, first of all, you have to have intent. And secondarily, you have to have motive. I had no crime to cover up. In the end, I was convicted of lying about the Trump campaign's interest in the WikiLeaks disclosures, which candidate Donald Trump himself announced on 142 occasions in September and October. There was never anything to hide. The witness tampering charge is an absurdity. The witness, Randy Credico, who I'm accused of threatening, said on the stand and in a letter to a judge that he never felt threatened. But the grand jury did have evidence that he sent an email to another grand jury witness, an exculpatory witness, threatening to put a hole in his head. He was not charged with witness tampering. Anyway, after this exhaustive investigation, as I think most Americans know, on the morning of January 25th, 2019, in the pre-dawn hours, my home was raided by 29 SWAT-clad assault rifle carrying FBI agents.
I was on the air that night, Roger, watching CNN when that was happening.
They arrived in 17 armored vehicles. They brought a giant battering ram up to my front door as if I wasn't going to answer the door. They had these really fierce-looking dogs, a canine unit on leashes. There's a helicopter overhead.
Jeez.
I lived on a canal at that time, and there were 2 amphibious units with frogmen who were also armed. They completely surrounded the house, and they banged on the door and said, "FBI, open the door." I did. They said, "Are you Roger Stone?" I said, "I am." They said, "We have a warrant for your arrest, and we have a warrant to search these premises. Please put your hands behind your back." Now, let's be clear. I have no previous criminal record. I'm charged with white-collar process crimes. I do not have a valid passport. I don't own a firearm, even though I am a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. And thanks to the beating I took for a year, Mueller closing in on Stone, Mueller focused on Stone, everybody in America knows what I look like. So the claim that I had to be arrested in this over-the-top Gestapo manner because I was a flight risk was completely disproved 3 hours later when the government didn't ask for a cash bond for my release. I was never a flight risk. But even more outrageous, as you point out, CNN was allowed to film the entire scene. They had a tripod 25 feet from my front door. Now, I know now, from looking at the security camera footage, that CNN showed up exactly 14 minutes before the FBI, and they say it was just a hunch.
No hunch. When you bring a live camera and remote unit, you've got hours of time to prepare for it. Somebody tipped them off, Raj.
No question about it. Now, to this day, FBI Director Christopher Wray refuses to hand over emails between CNN and the FBI in the days and weeks prior to my arrest, even though the law requires it. Right now, Judicial Watch is suing to get that material. I was frog marched out in front of the house barefoot, and I was wearing a Roger Stone Did Nothing Wrong T-shirt that I had put on that morning. My wife, who is hearing impaired, woke up looking down the barrel of guns. She, too, was marched out in the middle of the street in her bare feet and humiliated. I live on a dead-end street. I now know that the street had been sealed, and therefore the only media unit allowed in for this show was CNN. Looking at the camera security footage, I know that the FBI agents spoke to the camera crew several times. So I would like to know who ordered this raid, because my lawyers had spoken to the special counsel's office the day before.
And you still don't know?
We still don't know, meaning they know I was represented. If they had contacted my lawyer, I simply could have turned myself in, which is what the normal course is in cases like this, and save the taxpayers, I hope you're sitting down, $1.1 million.
My God.
For this extravaganza. Senator Lindsey Graham wrote a hot letter to the FBI demanding to know who approved this raid. Of course, he never got an answer, and he never followed up.
Roger, stay right there. We're going to take a break, but we will come right back, and we're going to keep you next hour as well to talk about the story. We might even try to get some phone calls in from our listeners, but we have much more to talk about with Roger Stone about his situation. Politics is a rough game, and I also want you to think about what would you do if you were running an election and you had the ability to get emails about your opponent that you could use to help win. Would you use it? We'll be back with Roger Stone in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Our special guest tonight, Roger Stone. We are talking about his personal situation now. He's been sentenced to 40 months in jail. Let's see what happens with that. Will the president pardon him? We'll get Roger's reaction to that. But let's get more of the story because, for really the first time, he's been under a gag order for 16 months. This is his opportunity to tell us his side of the story, what he believes happened. One of the questions I'm going to ask him when we come back right after the break here is, what's wrong with getting emails about your opponent? Is that against the law? I don't know. We'll be back in a moment with Roger Stone on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, along with Roger Stone. Roger, let me ask you this before we get into the rest of your story. If I were running for president, I'd want to talk with Putin from Russia, Khomeini of Iran, and as many political leaders as I could to get them to understand where I'm coming from and maybe get them to support my platform. Is there anything wrong with that?
I don't believe so. I actually always think that it is better to talk to your enemies than to launch thermonuclear missiles at them. But the question you asked before the break, is it illegal to receive emails about your opponent? In my case, it's an academic question. There was never any evidence whatsoever that I received anything from WikiLeaks or Julian Assange or the Russians or any other source. I was essentially convicted of lying about banter with other people in the campaign, speculating about what was to come. That's how ridiculous these charges are. I was arrested at 6 a.m. At 7 a.m., the special counsel's office email blasted a copy of my indictment to the entire media, and they put it up on their website. The problem with that is it wasn't unsealed by a magistrate until 9:30, so they violated the law. By the way, they also left the metadata tags on the document, so I know the notorious Andrew Weissman wrote my indictment. My indictment is a confection, to say the least. And at the time, I pled not guilty because I thought I would have a fair trial. Then Robert Mueller used a clever piece of legal trickery to ensure that rather than having a random selection of the judge, they claimed my case was related to a case he has brought against, I think it's 16 Russians, who he alleges hacked the DNC. There's never been any discovery in that case. They've never presented any evidence in that case. That case has nothing to do with me, but it ensured that my case would be heard by Amy Berman Jackson, an Obama appointee, the judge who dismissed the wrongful death suit against Hillary Clinton by the Benghazi families, the judge who ruled that tax dollars can be used for abortion, the judge who incarcerated Paul Manafort prior to his being convicted of any crime. Judge Jackson is a partisan. She would go on to violate my First, Fourth, and Sixth Amendment rights. But more precisely, she would essentially eliminate every powerful line of defense. I'll give you an example. But the underlying premise of my indictment is that the Russians hacked the DNC and gave the information to WikiLeaks. I was prohibited from proving in court with forensic evidence and experts like Bill Binney, the former technical director of the NSA for Russian affairs, that never happened. There is no evidence to support that claim. In fact, the forensic evidence would indicate that the stolen material was downloaded internally to a portable drive and taken out the back door. But I couldn't raise that question. How about selective prosecution? You have Comey, Brennan, McCabe, Clapper, Orr, Rosenstein, Mueller himself, all lying to Congress, but none of them prosecuted. No, Judge Jackson ruled that I could not pursue that line of defense. How about the misconduct of the FBI, the DOJ, the special counsel's office? As I will tell you later, they broke a lot of laws, or any member of Congress. No, I was prohibited from raising the question of their misconduct. Because we got the FBI to admit in discovery that they never inspected the servers at the Democratic National Committee, that they relied on a draft redacted report from an IT firm called CrowdStrike, funded by a couple of Hillary Clinton's supporters. When I began to talk about that, the judge tightened the gag order on me. Good God, we can't let Stone tell the American people the truth. The Steele dossier had crumbled. The entire Russian narrative was falling apart. Now I was challenging the Russians hacked the DNC theory, which to this day is incorrect. Not only that, but let's take a look at the prosecutors. Leading my prosecution team, Jeannie Rhee, former personal lawyer for Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation, the lawyer who represented them in the missing emails case. By the way, the same lawyer who lied to the judge in that case, claiming that all the material had been turned over to the court when it hadn't. Aaron Zelinsky, this guy's a real piece of work. A bully, a pompous ass who liked to threaten people, threatened my lawyers a couple of times. This guy was deputy counsel to Hillary Clinton at the State Department. And then at trial, a guy named Jonathan Kravis. The media kept describing him as a career line prosecutor. In fact, he was a deputy counsel to Barack Obama in the White House. These are political operatives. The idea that my prosecutors were biased violates the Constitution. I'm entitled to an unbiased prosecutor, to an honest prosecutor. I was prosecuted by Hillary Clinton's operatives. Why? Because I wrote the book, The Clintons' War on Women, because Donald Trump used it to great effect in 2016. It is still, to this day, the definitive work on the epic corruption of Bill, Hillary, and their daughter, not their daughter, pardon me, her daughter, Chelsea. So I was victimized by these people. They didn't allow me any lines of defense. And you might wonder, what was this all really about? On July 24th, 2019, we found out. That's when the prosecutors approached my lawyers to propose a quote-unquote deal. If your client was willing to fess up and tell the truth about 30 phone calls between him and candidate Trump in 2016, all of which lasted more than 30 minutes, well, we might be willing to recommend no jail time. In other words, they wanted me to lie. They wanted me
and they wanted Donald Trump, didn't they?
Right. That's what this was always about. It wasn't about Roger Stone, but I have a 40-year history with Donald Trump. I have wanted him to run for president since 1988. Were
you surprised when he won, Raj?
No, I really was not. I actually knew the Saturday before that he was going to win because I had access to some of the large state Republican Party polling. Donald Trump would never pay for polling, so the campaign had no polling. But I could see the trend line. Look, he completely outworked and outfoxed Hillary Clinton.
Well, he did. He did. It was an amazing campaign.
She spent in excess of $2 billion. He spent about $375 million all told. That's independent plus his campaign. He just ran a better campaign, and they never expected that they would lose. Therefore, they never expected that their emails would be examined. The prosecutorial misconduct in my case is every bit as egregious as what they did to General Flynn, but it's under a protective seal, so I can't discuss it. Jonathan Kravis filed a motion with the court saying that the government had additional information proving that the Russians hacked the DNC. Of course, he didn't provide any of it. That's because it doesn't exist. It was a fraud upon the court. In any event, the trial was a Soviet-style show trial. I was basically not allowed to defend myself. I was not allowed to defend myself outside the courtroom or in the media. I had a jury that had not a single Republican, not a single military veteran, not a single Roman Catholic, not a single African-American male, not a single union member, not a single person with just a high school education, no blue-collar workers. But I did have 3 veterans of the Clinton and Obama administration. I did have 3 attorneys. I did have a Democrat woman who ran for Congress. After I was found guilty on all counts, which was not surprising under the circumstances.
So you expected that?
Yeah, there was no question. No Republican or Trump supporter can get a fair trial in the District of Columbia, particularly when they limit the arguments you can make at trial.
Right.
Additionally, we learned that the jury forewoman, a Democrat from Tennessee, her name is Tomika Hart. She outed herself on CNN, so I'm not revealing her name. She actually tweeted and on Twitter and Facebook attacking me by name on the day I was arrested and subsequently, as well as consistently attacking Donald Trump.
You mean prior to the trial?
2019, the year before the trial. She misled the court during jury selection about this. In fact, she told the judge she didn't know who Roger Stone was. The U.S. Supreme Court guarantees every defendant an impartial and indifferent jury. This woman was in the tank from the beginning. Now, it is not enough under the law to just say she was a Democrat activist or that she hated Donald Trump, although I think that should be disqualifying. But in this case, she attacked me personally. When the judge said, well, that was your lawyer's responsibility to learn that, it was impossible to learn that because her social media platforms were on private settings during the trial.
Right, and unless you're a friend or a member, you're not going to see it.
After the trial, she took down her Facebook page. What she would normally do is take Facebook links and post them on Twitter. She had a Facebook page since 2008. She deleted it and opened a new one. When we asked the judge in a hearing for the right to subpoena the deleted material from Facebook, it was denied.
And is this the reason why you sought a new trial over that juror?
Yes, we made a motion for a new trial. Every legal expert from Jonathan Turley on the left, Judge Andrew Napolitano, Alan Dershowitz said it was a very simple case. The judge ruled that we had not proved the juror's bias. I should mention, by the way, I filed my notice of appeal in this case because the misconduct of the prosecutors and the rulings of this judge and the misconduct of these jurors give me a very, very strong grounds for appeal. This was a lynching. And then when I went to be sentenced, the judge said there was nothing phony about the Mueller investigation. Really? How come there's a special counsel about to indict those who started it? She also said Roger Stone was convicted of covering up for Donald Trump. That was not one of the charges, and that was unproven.
Jeez.
She attacked my belligerence, which is interesting because I never testified. So where was I belligerent? Outside the courtroom? Judges aren't supposed to be paying attention to what happens outside the courtroom. No, this was a kangaroo court start to finish, and I refuse to roll over on Donald Trump, which is the real reason why I was prosecuted. The most classic tactic they use is to destroy you financially. I mean, people need to recognize I lost my home, my savings, my car, my insurance, my ability to make a living, because I make a living by writing and speaking, but I was under a gag order. And literally, I raised $2.2 million from 65,000 great Americans who contributed to my legal defense fund, and I spent it all in the initial trial. I now have to raise money for the appeal. I've been very candid about the fact that while I have not formally applied for a pardon, which is not necessary, and my lawyers have had no discussions with anybody at the White House or in the administration about a pardon.
Do you have to apply for it, or can the president just do it on his own?
The president can just unilaterally do it. And I've been very candid, George. I pray for one every day.
Oh, I don't blame you. I don't blame you.
The only way I will get justice in this case.
And I don't think, Raj, and I've been thinking about this since you were convicted, that I don't think your particular case would hurt his political career if he pardons you at all. Because to me,
I think the exact opposite would be true. If he does not, as an act of mercy and justice, either commute my sentence or pardon me, I think a lot of his strongest supporters will be very disappointed.
Well, that's true. That's true. But I mean, the people who normally would have voted for him if he pardons you, I don't think they're going to blame him. They're going to say, good decision. You got Roger off. Good for you.
I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I go to trial. Rick Gates, Paul Manafort's partner, who was convicted of the same crimes that Manafort is doing 7 years for, testifies that he overheard a conversation between Donald Trump and I in a car riding to LaGuardia Airport. He says there are two Secret Service agents in the car, and even though he's all the way back in the third seat and Trump is in the front right seat, he sees my name pop up on Trump's cell phone. The government never produces the two Secret Service agents to corroborate this lie. We have a convicted liar who was allowed to walk out on not paying millions of dollars worth of taxes. The government produces no corroboration, no phone bill, and Donald Trump himself denied this in writing to Robert Mueller. I deny it. The timing of it, early August, doesn't even make sense. But Mr. Gates, in return for his lies, got a 45-day sentence.
What do you think those – go ahead, Raj. Go ahead.
Steve Bannon testified that he and I spoke regularly about WikiLeaks. But now, today, it was announced that Steve Bannon's testimony and mine and every witness before the House Intelligence Committee will soon be released. I'll be very anxious to see whether what Steve told the committee under oath is different than what he said on the stand, because he and I never discussed WikiLeaks, although according to him we discussed it in every conversation, and that I was viewed in the campaign as the access point to WikiLeaks, which would be news to me.
There was a story that came out of the Jerusalem Post just a few days ago that basically said Israel felt that they had some information on Hillary that they wanted to get to you or your associates. Again, what's wrong with that? If you're in a political campaign and somebody has some information, can't you get that?
Well, I mean, I think it is perfectly legal. But let's be clear. The two-party duopoly that run this country into the ground was desperate to get rid of a president they can't control. What Donald Trump has been able to do in 3 years, it boggles the mind. In other words, we were told that the manufacturing jobs would never come back, that America's greatest days were behind us, and we had to accept globalism. And Trump simply refused because he believes in American exceptionalism, because he believes that America is a special place. And yes, cutting taxes and regulation creates jobs. He brought us the lowest unemployment rates in our history. He brought us the fastest wage growth in our history. The entire Russian collusion narrative was a hoax to attempt to remove him. When that failed, they ginned up the Ukrainian hoax. That was a fraud as well. And I have concerns about coronavirus.
I was just going to ask you about that. What do you think about that?
I am not a scientist. I do know people. My son is a police officer. I know people on the force who have died of it. It is clearly a serious virus. But it did have the effect of destroying our economy. And some people, like Bill Gates, have exploited it in their campaign for mandatory vaccinations and some kind of tracking system. I don't care whether it's a bracelet or an armband or a microchip. I'm against it. And I'm opposed to mandatory vaccinations. But they have destroyed the strongest economy we've ever had. The good news is,
in 2 months,
Donald Trump knew how to do it once. Believe me, he knows how to do it again.
Raj, we're going to take a quick break. We're at the top of the hour. We're going to come back. We're going to talk more about this case. I want to get your take on the 40 months that they have given you and get your take on that. And we'll take some phone calls with our listeners as well. Roger Stone's website linked up at coasttocoastam.com, as well as his Twitter link. And a couple of his books include Stone's Rules, Jeb and the Bush Crime Family as well. We will be back in a moment with political consultant Roger Stone right here on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. And by the way, this is not a partisan show. It's not about President Donald Trump. It's about what happened to Roger Stone, and could it happen to just about anybody. Roger, originally the prosecutors wanted 7 to 9 years. You got 40 months. How did that happen?
Well, it's very interesting. The prosecutors, who the mainstream media continues to insist were career-line prosecutors, but I already told you who they were. They were political operatives. Only one of them was actually a career prosecutor, wrote a sentencing memo that recast the truth. So, for example, I wrote a book on the Mueller investigation. It published on February 9th. The gag order was put in place February 12th. But their sentencing memo said the publication of the book violated the gag order. That was false. I posted a photo on my Instagram account that was created by an organization called Americans for Innovation. It had their logo on it. The government claimed it was not over the judge's face, but it did have a picture of the judge. The government claimed that was a crosshair and that I was threatening the judge.
Okay. All right.
I explained on the stand that wasn't true, but more importantly, I have a sworn affidavit from a witness that one of the assistant U.S. attorneys told that we knew all along that wasn't a crosshair and that it was the watermarked logo of the organization that created that image. You'll be hearing about that on appeal, I assure you. So they basically recast the facts of this case. The sentencing memo accuses me of foreign interference in the election. I wasn't charged with that. There is no evidence of that. The 7 to 9 year sentence was all out of proportion to reality. I actually think the 40-year sentence is excessive, but the judge added every enhancement she could.
And most of those prosecutors resigned later, right?
Right, but in a theatrical move, they resigned because senior officials at the Department of Justice said that 7 to 9 was excessive. The 7 to 9 was based on a series of lies. They recast the trial saying that I was involved in foreign interference in the election. That isn't what the court found. But they weren't career prosecutors. They either worked as political appointees for Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, as I outlined earlier. And the idea that Barr interfered, no, the new acting U.S. attorney for D.C. was misled about what they were going to ask for. Now, where does it go from here? I will vigorously appeal. I think my trial is fatally flawed. People who want to help me can go to stonedefensefund.com. I'm going to start from the beginning. I have two new lawyers, Seth Ginsburg and David Schoen. They are excellent. They have reviewed the case and will file an appeal should that become necessary. I will make a motion to the court to stay execution of my sentence pending the hearing of my appeal. The chances of that being granted by the judge are very unlikely. I have the right to appeal that to the full circuit. But, George, I appealed the unconstitutional gag order to the full circuit. They sat on it for 4 months.
Jeez.
While CNN rained urine on me every day. Russian spy, Russian traitor. Stone was the link between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks. All these things have been disproved. When's my apology? Oh,
exactly. Well, you know what is true? You're a tough political guy. And if I were in a campaign, I'd want you on my side. Because, you've worked with President Richard Nixon at the time, Ronald Reagan, President Trump. You've worked with a number of other Republicans. You're Republican. But, you are a tough political guy, and you don't lose.
To accuse me of Russian collusion, my relatives were mowed down by Soviet tanks in the streets of Budapest in 1956. I got into politics through Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan and their anti-communism. I hate the Russian system. To accuse me of treason, like this guy Nick Ackerman, former Watergate prosecutor, has accused me on MSNBC of treason. That's defamatory. Even I can be defamed. This is outrageous. But none of these claims that I was that I was trafficking materials between WikiLeaks or the Russians and the Trump camp, none of that was proven to be even close to be true. So they fabricated this lying to Congress charge, which I frankly think I would ultimately win on appeal. Frankly, I hope that that's not necessary. The president, in his tweets, very clearly knows that this jury was corrupted, very clearly knows that the jury forewoman said that all of Trump's supporters are racists. That would, of course, include me. He clearly knows that the juror attacked me by name in her social media platforms. The judge says that doesn't prove bias. With all due respect, I disagree. I'm hoping that as an act of mercy and justice, the president will either commute my sentence or pardon me. I pray for it every day. I think it is the right course based on what has happened. Let's be clear. The people who set up General Flynn are the exact same people who set me up, and they tried to set up Donald Trump, and thank God they failed.
If and when he pardons you, what are you going to do next to pick up your life? What's the future hold for Roger?
I'm going to write a book about this entire experience because I think the average citizen needs to know that in the blink of an eye, you can lose all your constitutional freedoms, your right to speak, your right to travel, your ability to make a living. It's really quite draconian. It's very hard for me to believe that this has happened. And then there is the government using their tactics to induce people to lie against you at trial, making deals to lie. They had exculpatory witnesses before the grand jury. They knew that Randy Credico was my source. 3 witnesses testified to the grand jury that Credico himself told them that he was my source. I had mountains of emails and text messages and videos demonstrating that he was my source. Yet at trial, the government claimed that he was not my source, but that my source regarding the fact that WikiLeaks was going to publish something in October, that's the big secret, which was announced by Julian Assange in June, was Dr. Jerry Corsi. But Dr. Corsi testified that he never had any contact whatsoever with WikiLeaks.
Yeah, well, they went after him too.
How is that even possible?
Jerry comes on the program a lot, and they went after him for a long time. He escaped with his neck.
Well, they were trying to pressure him to testify falsely against me.
He wouldn't do it.
That was all about. In the end, he would not do it. So one of the other great falsehoods of the left is when Manafort was under attack for his Eastern European business dealings, I posted a tweet that said it would soon be the Podesta's multiple time in the barrel. What I meant by that was that the Podesta brothers' very lucrative Russian and Eastern European business dealings, insurance, banking, gas, and oil, would soon be under scrutiny, as Manafort was. When WikiLeaks, 3 months later, published John Podesta's emails, it is alleged that Stone obviously knew in advance that Podesta's emails had been stolen. I didn't say anything about his emails. That was completely unproven. There is no evidence that I knew that his emails had been obtained. But it was an article of faith on the left, and Aaron Zelinsky, kind of like Ahab in Moby Dick, insisted that I had this information and I was hiding it. They ransacked my home. They went through in a 13-hour search. They went through every square inch of my home, my office, and my apartment in New York. I have many books. They would take a book off the shelf, flip through it to make sure there was nothing inside, and throw it on the floor.
Jeez.
If there was a picture hanging on the wall, they would take the picture down. They would cut out the back of the picture to see if I was hiding something in the frame. You know what they found in their search? Nothing whatsoever.
Let's take some calls for you, Rod. You ready?
Yep, absolutely.
Let's go to Johnny in St. Louis to get started here. Hey, John, go ahead.
Thank you, Roger. You're an amazing patriot. I thank you for what you've done and standing up for President Trump. I just know this is all, Andrew Weissman and Robert Mueller, James Comey. I mean, these are traitors of the first degree. Your patriotism is amazing, and I followed you all the way, and I appreciate, I know you were working with Alex Jones on the air and stuff. And, I followed along with you, and, we are responsible together, all of us together, of defeating the Democrats in 2016 and getting the truth out. But we all got the truth at the same time. We all got, thank God for Julian was such a patriot, who get the truth out. But the charges are false that they brought against you, and lies, the timelines, and we all know that. And I pray also every day for President Trump to exonerate you, to pardon you.
Well, if I were a betting man, I think that's probably going to happen, to be sure. But you've got a lot of support out there, Raj.
That is true, and I think there are millions and millions of people praying for me and my family. I had the occasion several months ago to meet Reverend Franklin Graham. I was raised as a Roman Catholic. I had all my sacraments in that church. My parents saw that I had a good religious education, but I have to admit to you, I had strayed from the church. I'd had a pretty wild time in my younger days. And Reverend Graham, whose father I met when I worked for Richard Nixon, Billy Graham, one of the greatest men of the century, in my opinion, Reverend Franklin Graham told me in no uncertain terms that I could end the turmoil and the anger and the fear in my life if I would reaffirm my faith in God. And I have done that. I'm not here to give a religious sermon. This isn't a religious program. I understand that. But I must tell you, it has brought me enormous strength, enormous solace, enormous peace, because it is now in his hands. And I know there are people out there who are going to say, oh, come on, Roger Stone, give me a break. This is a head fake. This is a ploy. This is an effort to get public sympathy. None of that is true. I have found a peace in the Bible. I've found peace in my personal life, and I know at the end of the day this will all work out because I think I have God's protection. I think if you walk in His path, He will never desert you. So that's the end of my proselytizing, but that's how I've been able to hold it together. I mean, it is really extraordinarily difficult. My wife has substantial medical problems. We lost our health insurance. I can't pay her medical expenses. They put this pressure on me to get me to turn on the president. And I refused. I would not bear false witness against Donald Trump, who's been a friend for 40 years. He came to the wedding for my wife and I. I went to 2 of his weddings. I've thought for many years he had the independence and the courage to be a great president. As you point out, George, the show is not partisan, but I would suggest that instead of looking at things at Republicans versus Democrats, that's not really the way to look at it. It's insiders and outsiders.
Exactly.
The two-party duopoly, the elites of both parties work together, and together they have given us endless war where our inherent national interests are not clear. The erosion of our civil liberties, where they track our phone calls and our emails, these big one-size-fits-all international trade deals that have sucked the jobs out of America, immigration policies that cheat the people who are waiting legally to come here for the promise of America and reward the people that come here illegally and make our streets and neighborhoods unsafe, and fiscal policies that drive our debt into the stratosphere and tax us at confiscatory rates so it actually discourages entrepreneurism. Donald Trump has reversed all of that, and he's done it in just 3 years. It's not because he's a Republican. It's because he's an outsider. It's because nobody owns him. He's the first president in my lifetime who got to the White House without owing anybody.
Yeah.
Not Wall Street, not the banks, not the insurance companies, not the oil companies. He is his own man. He answers only to the American people. And that's why the deep state, you can call them the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower did, but the permanent government in place, the neocons looking for the next war that have dominated the intelligence agencies and the upper echelons, unfortunately, of our military, were desperate to get rid of Donald Trump because Donald Trump wanted peace. Donald Trump wanted to withdraw us from Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq, where we have spent millions and spilled American blood.
And we're still there.
I can't even explain why. We're still there.
Let's go to Ed in Charlotte, North Carolina. Hey, Eddie, go ahead.
Thanks, George. Well, I got 2 points. One, the prosecutors he mentioned, my understanding, if you'll look back, that was all, like he says, a theater, because they came up with a sentence, and under the process of the Justice Department, it's a federal court. They always are supposed to go to the head of the department. And Barr the night before said, my gosh, this is nothing like what we had in mind for punishment. And then when he opened his mouth the next day, they had all the TV stations lined up to scream, he's interfering, when in fact they were interfering by not reporting, going to the head of the department ahead of time, and they all in this theater resigned. 3 of them still, stayed on, but they, one resigned the department. But the point is that they were able to use this to make it look like Barr was interfering, when the process is that in a federal court, the procedure is you go to the head of the department. They did not do that, and they falsely made it look like he was interfering in the process. The other thing I'd like to say is simply that it is very scary when you've got just what he just said about the insiders of the swamp and the bureaucracy. What happens that's scary is it's almost like when those people get their claws in you, it's almost like we're old-fashioned dictatorship, and our freedom and our rights are completely submerged and stripped from us. That is really scary what this judge has done, because the foreman he talks about is also a lawyer, and she also appeared at rallies protesting Donald Trump when he was running for office. And on that alone, is that not true, Roger? That thing should be thrown out.
Absolutely. You are absolutely correct on both points. What's even particularly interesting and has been a great frustration to me is the judge left the gag order on me after I was convicted.
Yeah.
Now,
Once you're convicted, you should be able to say anything you want. Hold on, Roger. We're at this break. We'll let you finish up that statement when we come right back, and then we'll take final calls. And we'll be back in a moment with Roger Stone, our final segment here, as we'll take your calls and continue chatting with him about his situation, giving him an opportunity to talk around the world publicly about his side of the story. And I think that's so important to be able to balance that. Next hour, David Ditchfield joins us, by the way. He fell under a speeding train, went to the other side, and came back to talk about it, and he'll be talking about it on Coast to Coast in a moment. And welcome back to Coast, back with our final segment with Roger Stone. Roger, Ed from Charlotte wanted to know about the Democrat-Republican deep state members, and they're in there. They're there in both parties, aren't they?
There's no question. There is a ruling elite that have dominated both parties. They are neocons. They resisted Donald Trump, but Donald Trump's nomination was the hostile takeover of the Republican Party, where he ousted the Bush Country Club wing of the party, and they won't be back. He's changed the face of the Republican Party forever. But there's no question that some Republicans are supporting Donald Trump, not because they want to, but because they have to. And the reason they have to is because back home in their districts or their states, the president is far more popular than they are. Lindsey Graham's a perfect example. He talks constantly on television about investigating the Russian collusion hoax. He pledged to get to the bottom of who approved the over-the-top FBI raid on my home. Senator, where are the hearings? Where are the subpoenas? When are you actually going to do something as opposed to just talk about doing something?
After the president got elected, Roger, did you go up to him and say, President Trump, slow down on the tweets a little bit? Did you do that?
There would be no point in that. That's the thing about Donald Trump. First of all, the first time I met him, which was in 1979, I was working for Governor Ronald Reagan. I had finagled a meeting with him to ask him to be on Reagan's finance committee. And I said, it's a great honor to meet you, Mr. Trump. And he said, please call me Donald. And I have called him Donald for 40 years. The day after he became president, I said, congratulations, Mr. President. And he said, please call me Donald. He is a very unassuming guy. There's nothing formal or phony or what you see is what you get. His view of the tweets is exactly correct. It's the only way he can talk to the people unfiltered by the fake news media. Mm-hmm. I mean, you saw the story last week. He was recommending a specific drug that has proved effective in the treatment of coronavirus, they said, because he owns stock in the company. Well, it turns out that he owns a fund, and he stood to make a whopping $29 out of the success of this particular drug. But the smears and the vituperation and the hatred, I mean, I was about to make this point before we went to break. The judge left the gag order in place after my trial, she said, to protect the witnesses and the jurors. Like I'm some kind of gangster.
Like you're going to beat them all up or something.
I mean, just because I sometimes dress like a gangster doesn't mean that I am one.
You're a little flamboyant. You're flamboyant.
If you want to see threats, if you want to see death threats, I can show them to you. The death threats against my wife, my children, my grandchildren. My oldest granddaughter had my first great-grandchild, a great-grandson, a month ago. The nasty emails and text messages wishing that baby would be still.
That's unfortunate. I'm sorry to hear that.
And I got to a point, George, where I could not go out in public to a restaurant or any public setting because people seem to think that they can just call you a traitor, and worse, some of them actually want to get physical. Now, if I disagreed with your politics and I saw you in the street, I wouldn't call you names.
No.
And I certainly wouldn't take a swing at you. But some of these liberals are unhinged.
It's unfortunate.
Absolutely unhinged. And we have had to live with the death threats and the threats of violence, which, I report to the local police.
Let's go to Mike in Denver, Colorado. Michael, go ahead.
Good morning, George. Thank you so much for taking my call. And, Roger, it's really, really an honor to speak with you tonight. It's interesting, Roger, because you look at the media coverage today compared to in the time of like Nixon, and it's really unparalleled. And I think it's really sad how we have these trials by media, so to speak. And I think that that's what you went through, and I apologize for that happening. As a millennial, I feel like you do a lot for my generation, and I really appreciate all your work, which leads me to my question. So obviously, I think a lot of our ideas about politics are formed kind of when we're growing up in college, in high school. And I know that that played a big part of your life when you went to Georgetown. And in high school, I know you were a member of your political club, Young Republicans. And that kind of leads me to my question, which is, what role do you feel like the millennial vote has today, and what importance does it have? Thank you.
All right. I'm happy to take your question. First of all, the substantial difference between the media in the time of Nixon, let's say, and today is the Internet. In Nixon's day, we had one monolithic media, 3 networks, a bunch of very powerful national news magazines, Newsweek, Time, most of them all gone now. And they dominated coverage of politics, and they set a narrative. I'll give you a perfect example. I wrote a book about it. I wrote a book called The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. It was my first book.
That was you. That was you. That's right.
It's a New York Times bestseller. But the mainstream media sold the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy and acted alone. He was a lone nut communist. And there was no forum until the Internet came along from which you could challenge that. 2016 marks the time the mainstream media lost their stranglehold on the political narrative. The rise of a robust, vibrant, alternative media based on the Internet gave Donald Trump and his supporters a platform from which they could counter-punch. That's why there is this great move towards Internet censorship today. The globalists and the neocons want to put the toothpaste back in the tube. I think it's too late for that, but it explains the censorship. Now, let me go to your question. I am a big fan of Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA. I think they do an extraordinary job of going onto the campuses and explaining free enterprise, explaining the basics of the Constitution, explaining our constitutional freedoms, and I think that is absolutely crucial. When I have an opportunity to speak on campuses, either colleges or high schools, I'm somehow usually astounded because children are not taught history anymore. They don't know who Abraham Lincoln was. They don't know who George Washington was. They don't know anything about the history of the country other than everybody who started the country is a racist, which, of course, is nonsense. It is an enormous problem, the way that liberal elites have infiltrated all of the education facilities in the country to preach an ideology that is false regarding the origins of the country.
Think we can get the president on this program after you get pardoned, Roger, for a little hour or so of taking phone calls and things like that?
Well, as far as the pardon goes, from your mouth to God's ear. But, let's see what happens. I think it would be very good. One of the things that disappoints me is he should do more alternative media. The alternative media is responsible for helping him get elected, and nobody understands the media cycle like Donald Trump. Why you would ever give an interview to CBS is beyond me. First of all, there's nobody watching anymore.
That's all changed. It sure has. Let's go next to Dan in Oklahoma City. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. I've been following this for quite some time, like a lot of Americans, and I agree with a lot of the points that Roger made tonight, just like the things that, young people aren't taught anymore. And one of them is, I think, not to challenge, or to be afraid to challenge and have political discourse. But I want to draw two important distinctions here.
Sure.
About the justice system. like going back to the book that Roger, a very revealing book, I might add, the best one I've ever read on the JFK assassination in Dallas. If you take what happened, like just a couple of key points that he made in the location chapter in that book, where Oswald was hired a solid 5 weeks prior to Kennedy's arrival in Dallas, and yet the Kennedy administration's handlers, they didn't determine the motorcade route until like 4 days prior to his arrival. So how would Oswald would have known to have, how would he have known to get a job there
in that building?
Book depository, which the man that owned it was close friends with LBJ. That was another very revealing point, I thought. But how that was ignored, the reason I bring that up is the fact that so many key things like that, that were ignored then and even now. And then you go up to like even what happened with Joe Biden in Burisma in the Ukraine, and where he actually bragged and boasted in front of the CFR right there on TV that he told that Ukrainian leader that if he didn't fire that prosecutor that I think was looking into the Burisma situation with Biden, that he wouldn't get aid. So I don't understand, where's the justice on a lot of these things there? And then, and then so many conservatives, it's like they light us up. But time after time, I guess where I'm going with this is, what can Donald Trump and his Attorney General Barr do to overhaul the justice system from top to bottom? That's my question.
Well, that's an interesting question. Can they do anything, Raj?
Well, they can. First of all, I think the president needs to fire the FBI director, who has been actively caught in an act of obstruction. He fought the release of the exculpatory material that should have been turned over to General Flynn. He's in court right now fighting to keep secret a catch of documents that were passed from the Clinton campaign to the FBI during 2016 that are allegedly negative information on candidate Trump. I think we should see that, not be fighting to keep it a secret. The Justice Department, unfortunately, is still staffed top to bottom with Obama and Clinton holdovers, and the president never cleaned house. Sure, he appointed a cabinet. Jeff Sessions was an enormous mistake. Rod Rosenstein is responsible for the Mueller investigation. Bryce Previs, the former Republican national chairman, former White House chief of staff, recommended Rosenstein. Why you would hire this guy, I have no idea. But really, I guess the point here is we have a two-tier justice system. The Inspector General of the Justice Department recommended the prosecution of former FBI Director James Comey twice, and the Department of Justice declined to prosecute. Congress passed my testimony to Robert Mueller by a vote of the committee with no recommendation, but I was prosecuted. The crimes that James Comey and Andrew McCabe committed are far more serious than what I was charged with. But we see this again and again. Brennan, Clapper, Hillary Clinton, Huma Abedin, McCabe, Strzok, Page. This list goes on and on. None of these people are being prosecuted, while I'm looking at 3.5 years in jail on ridiculous charges in which the things that I misled Congress about were immaterial. Were just not. Had nothing to hide. Had I answered the questions differently, they wouldn't have found Russian collusion either, because there was none. This two-tier justice system has to stop. If John Durham does not prosecute John Brennan, who is the mastermind of this whole scheme, and all of those who attempted to set up the president, who did set up General Flynn, who did set me up, then I think the average American's faith in our judicial system will be destroyed.
Minute to go, Raj. If you had it to do all over again, what would you do differently, if anything?
Absolutely nothing. Those who want to help me can sign the petition to the president at freerogerstone.com. George, thank you so much for this opportunity to tell my side of the story.
I'm going to predict we're going to have you back on the program after you're pardoned. My guess.
Well, I hope you turn out to be right. And again, I want to thank all those millions of people who are praying for me and my family. God bless you.
Good luck, Roger, and the best to your family. You shouldn't have to go through that, some of those things you were saying. Roger Stone. Up next, we're going to be talking about near-death experiences here on Coast to Coast. So get on up to our website and look at the guest's work that he supplied to Lex, our webmaster, that he put up there. Fascinating stuff. Also, sign up for our free YouTube channel, Coast to Coast AM Official, that you can put in the search bar at YouTube or click the link at the top of the coasttocoastam.com homepage. We will be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM.